Hello and welcome to International Voices with Udo Fluck. I am the Director of Global and Cultural Affairs in Arts Missoula, and I'm hosting these internationally focused and themed radio recordings once a month, produced by 103.3 The Trail in Missoula. If you have not had a chance to listen to the February broadcast with my special guest, Tom Benson, Executive Director of Arts Missoula, or my March radio show with special guest Mayor John Engen, please visit the Arts Missoula website at www.artsmissoula.org. Those podcasts also have lots of background information on the Office of Global and Cultural Affairs, which I have the pleasure of overseeing, our mission, and the services the office provides, including sister city management, intercultural training, and outreach programs into K through 12, and community programming. My third broadcast should have focused on the international activities and programming that were originally scheduled for the end of March, but with UM's World Fest canceled, the Worldview film series scratched, the International Community Speaker Series postponed, and all because of the coronavirus, I thought it would be appropriate to dedicate this broadcast to COVID-19 with an international perspective. It is an honor to have Dr. Sarj Patel on this podcast today, a truly international voice. I'm super excited about my special guest, who connects particularly well to our current situation. Dr. Patel is a British and American educated former Associate Research Professor and neuroscience researcher with Indian roots. He has worked for the Missoula-based Montana Neuroscience Institute and in association with them. He's also the president and co-founder of FYR Diagnostics, a research laboratory based in the Garden City that is currently working on developing novel diagnostic tests for human health and agriculture. He moved to the United States after completing an undergraduate degree in pharmacology at the University of Sunderland in the UK and received a master's degree in neuroscience from the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College, London in 1994, followed by a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Montana in Missoula in 2000. Following a postdoctoral position at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery, Patel returned to the University of Montana as a research associate in the NIH COBRE Center for Structural and Functional Neuroscience. He's the recipient of 2 GE NFL Head Health Challenge Awards and a Montana Research and Economic Development Initiative Award for his work on traumatic brain injury. He also has received funding from the NIH to develop biomarkers for post-traumatic epilepsy. I want the listeners to know that Dr. Patel and I are practicing social distance at its best today. We are actually in 2 different locations, me at home in the dining room and Dr. Patel in his FYR Diagnostics research lab. We are seeing each other via Zoom, a video conferencing program, and the entire conversation is recorded this way. Thanks to Heidi Sterrett from The Trail for all her support with the logistics, and to Michael Smith at The Trail, who was kind enough to edit and polish the raw interview and release the final podcast version this Thursday. International Voices is always published the first Thursday of the month. A shout out to the awesome team at the trail. Welcome, Dr. Patel. It is a privilege to have you as my guest today.
Hi, Udo. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. I think everybody is familiar with the virus that has caused the current pandemic, but if you're not, here's a brief summary of how it started and how we got to where we currently are. Please allow me to provide a brief, very brief history of the coronavirus or the family of the coronaviruses. Historically, coronavirus is an organism that has been associated with a common cold, asthma, and bronchitis. Its name is derived from the characteristic petal shape that give the virus a crown or a corona appearance. Coronavirus disease was first described in 1931, with the first coronavirus isolated from humans in 1965. Not much happened for almost 40 years until the outbreak of the severe acute respiratory syndrome, also known as SARS, in late 2002. And a decade later, the Middle East respiratory syndrome, also known as MERS, which was first reported in Saudi Arabia in 2012. The current epidemic of COVID-19 began circulating in Wuhan, China in December of last year. COVID-19 is similar to coronaviruses in bats, and it is likely that this typically non-human virus has jumped species into humans. Like the flu, person-to-person transmission occurs through microdroplets that are created when an infected person sneezes or coughs. The virus can also be transmitted by an infected person touching a surface or an object, and the virus is unknowingly picked up by a healthy person. One key aspect of slowing the spread of COVID-19 seems to be the ability to test people widely. What are the current bottlenecks in testing? What is the importance of testing a larger number of the population is my first question to Dr. Patel.
Well, Udo, those are two very important questions. If I answer the second one first, I think
Sure.
The importance of testing a larger population seems like common sense because currently we're still trying to get a handle on exactly how far-reaching this pandemic is. In a country as large as the United States, where you have a large population, the transmission, it's been shown that the transmission of the virus doesn't necessarily lead to the display of symptomology that someone has been infected. To get a better handle on exactly how many people are actually carrying this virus, and then to give us a better idea of the potential scale of this epidemic, it's very, very important to have an accurate representation of that number. And the only way we can do that currently is to screen the population. Currently, unfortunately, due to the logistical nature of being physically able to do that, both in terms of having the resources, in terms of the actual test kits, and then also being able to reach out to the population in a way that, one, doesn't allow the transmission of the disease to be further amplified, in a way to be able to get testing completed that doesn't increase the risk to the folks being tested of catching the disease, has been a logistical nightmare, to say the least. And state officials and federal officials have been trying their best to see how to tackle this problem. In terms of bottlenecks, again, it's a supply and demand kind of situation, not only in terms of the testing, but in terms of having the necessary equipment, personal protective equipment, that we all hear of these shortages. And so these things are really highlighting just how dramatic of a pandemic this actually is. And, as you expand that beyond the borders of this particular country and look across the world, you can see that a very similar situation has arisen in just about every country where this virus has now established a hold. And, the logistical issues for different countries varies by obviously where the populations are and how frequent testing is happening, whether they have the means to do that. Again, very similar to here.
Right.
And so those things are, while making it difficult to test, also highlight that testing as a primary method of attack to understand how this disease is spreading is key.
Right. You provided a perfect segue into my next question, and that is that our media has provided us with lots and lots of information on the spread and current COVID-19 situation in the United States. We have some information on Asia and Europe, but some don't seem to have a lot of information about other regions and countries in the world. How important is it from your perspective when we talk about a global pandemic to be globally competent?
That's another great question. I think at this time, while it's easy to be insular and look at what's happening within our own borders, and obviously our focus is going to be for anybody living within the United States, exactly what is happening here, even to a degree of what is happening within our own states. We know that different states are suffering to various degrees. I think the same thing can be said globally on an international scale when you look at regions of the world, and obviously the Far East, obviously where this originated, was believed to originate in China. When you look at populations in countries such as Africa, potentially India right now, there's some pretty, horrific things happening there with the methods that have implemented to try and tackle the spread of this particular pandemic in that country. And I have obviously very close roots to India, being my folks originating from Northwest India, and currently there they have tried to tackle by shutting the country down and limiting the much like here, sort of shelter-in-place policies, but it was done with such severity. There are hundreds of thousands of people currently migrating across the country, trying to get home to their villages. Most of the folks working in India in the big cities are people from rural districts who are trying to better their lives. And the shutdown of the infrastructure in India has sparked a mass exodus of people trying to get back to their villages in the more rural parts of India.
Sure.
With many people, families walking hundreds of miles to get home. And unfortunately, the inadvertent effect of that has been to produce mass crowds and, the very opposite of what they were trying to achieve. And so, the global impact there is, it's having a very different effect on different countries and inadvertent outcomes. In Africa as well, you have large populations of people that are very close to each other that can't socially distance. Things that we believe now can help flatten this curve and really help healthcare systems deal with how fast this is spreading. And all you have to do is look at Italy as well. Unfortunately, they have the highest mortality rate currently due to this pandemic, and they've had to take some very severe measures to try and stop this within their own population. Europe is in a very unique situation there too. Open borders, are part of what make the EU the state that it is.
Right.
But in light of what has happened, those borders have been closed, and so that's prevented people potentially getting back home.
Oh, sure. I can own. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. And so, those are some of the other aspects of this that, you don't really see necessarily here so much. Right. But it's having a big effect globally.
I can only imagine what that would look like to have a shelter-in-place order for over 1.2 billion people.
Yes.
I mean, it's the sheer size of the population. In India, there's only one population larger than that, and that is China.
Yes.
But, a close second with over 1.2 billion people in India, that must be, like you said, logistically for people to get to where they would shelter in place would also require them to travel either by train or by foot or by car, and so just getting to places and at the same time avoiding crowded locations. It seems to be just sort of a mind-boggling aspect to all of this.
It's impossible. I mean, there is no way to achieve that. I mean, the people are calling it an exodus. Some of the exodus out of the cities into the more rural areas are very much akin to when India gained independence and millions of people were moving east and west across the East Pakistani border. And so, looking back at that, India has also been affected by plague epidemics and things like that. And even back then, I think this was in the late 1800s, to deal with that, that was at the time of the British Raj, they basically moved the poor out of the city of Bombay, as it was known back then. And inadvertently, what they did was they pushed the plague into other regions of India. And so, that those kinds of things, unfortunately, are happening again. And it's that eye on history that we have to have, and that understanding that, we have to be somewhat measured and understand the repercussions of some of these things we're implementing. And that's, I'm assuming that's going to be the same everywhere.
Right.
Go ahead.
And as you said, there are many parts of this world that are considered developing, that are considered developing regions or countries. And so not everybody has access to running water the way that we do. And so this entire idea, which leads me to my second question, while we promote through hand washing as one of the most effective ways to reduce the risk of infection, which is relatively easy for us to follow, on March 22nd, which was World Water Day, the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, had released information that 3 billion people cannot wash their hands at home. What options do those people have to slow the spread of COVID-19 is a big question that was going through my mind, and I thought I'd pass it on to you because we are so, we're so set on the way we do things. And so promoting hand washing and doing that in the family and with friends and colleagues is one thing if you have running water. But if you don't, what other options are there?
Yeah, again, great point. I mean, it's very easy for us in the developed world here to enact, again, these rules. And this is something that's been known for a while. Washing hands has a huge impact on whether this, not just this particular virus, but any other kind of global pandemic can be passed along and infect a population. One of the things, getting the message out to these people, obviously we're talking large swaths of Africa, even some parts of India and other developing nations throughout the Far East. We have to, it's up to the local authorities to really get the messages out that, very simple steps can have a huge impact on whether this transmission occurs. And it's very, very difficult, unfortunately, in those situations. These people are living in poverty. Washing hands might not be a priority for them in getting them to understand that these simple measures are important. Really requires, the state and federal officials in those countries to provide a cohesive message to everyone that doing this and is important. Again, right. Saying that, though, I have to be honest, again, for large portions of this population, it's going to be very, very difficult to do that. I mean, they have so many other things that they're dealing with on a daily basis that, the priority for this may not be that high. And I think we'll see it all over the world. There are poor in developed nations too, that these messages, while they might get there, the impact on their lives and the ordeals of their daily lives can sometimes override the ability to do some of these things. And I hate to say it, but we may, see, that's usually where pandemics like this hit hardest. We've seen it in the past, and I believe, unfortunately, it potentially is going to get worse before it starts getting better in that respect.
Right. Now, you talked a little bit about this in my first question. As a scientist with a diverse ethnic and cultural background, how much do you rely on global data? How much do you actually look outside of your own laboratory in your own state within this country, and you look at other places in the world and the data that they accumulated? And I guess one question there that I would have as a non-scientist is, are they all measured the same way? I mean, is there an international sort of standard that applies so that a scientist in the United States could take the data and basically convert it one for one? Or is this difficult? How much does a scientist like yourself rely on global data?
It's a super, super complex issue. We do have to look at what is happening, and especially in a pandemic like this, knowing how transmission is occurring, knowing how quickly it is spreading through a population, knowing what measures they are taking and how they are potentially factoring into that spread is it's hugely complex. But we are starting to get a little bit of insight, and obviously when we look at this data, we have to look at it objectively, like any scientist when they're evaluating what they're reading and what they're seeing. But there are some really interesting findings coming out based on how different countries are, handling the issue of testing and how that's impacting the spread in those countries. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot on the news about South Korea and the implementation of testing for the majority of the population, and it's given them a very good handle on curbing the spread, isolating people that are infected, even though they may not be showing any symptomology. And I think that's where this disease is sort of unique from, even things like the flu, which we've become very used to in our daily lives. We know the flu, pandemics of the past, 1918, wiped out huge populations, swaths of the populations across the globe as well. In this case, I think it's very important to realize that the global data that we see from, let's say, a country like Iceland, I was reading recently, is this week. Iceland is a small nation, an island, so it's isolated, and they've implemented testing of the entire population, whether they're symptomatic or not. And some very interesting data from that particular population, and this may not be indicative of what's happening, in other countries or in larger countries with a greater diversity of the population. But, they're seeing that from the people that they've screened, that you actually see more infection in slightly younger age groups. We know that this is very adversely affecting people in the later stages of their lives, and then obviously any comorbidity with any respiratory or heart issues, autoimmune disorders such as diabetes, those comorbidities those diseases along with this infection can have some very severe consequences. In a lot of nations, we're only testing people who are exhibiting signs of sickness. And so when you look at that population, it tends to give us the indication that it's primarily affecting older people because they're the ones that are succumbing. And so we have to be very, very careful when especially because we're at this stage across the planet where we're making policy and making decisions based on this data. And so you have to be very, very careful at how you look at that. But so as a scientist, and I'm sure, I'm not an epidemiologist, but those folks, who are on the front lines of trying to understand, do the modeling that we're using to try and understand how this is spreading and how our measures of intervention are affecting how this disease is spreading, and not only locally, state, but on a nationwide, global arena is very, very important. So that data is key to understand.
Right. I figured that there was a huge component of your work outside or looking at outside data to then draw conclusions that apply to the inside of a population. But along with that, and you had mentioned that earlier, is this sort of cultural issue, perhaps that has to do with population density. It has to do with cultural practices. And as an intercultural researcher, I have long been fascinated with the concept of low and high contact cultures and countries, also known as proxemics, a concept that originally developed by Edward T. Hall, an American anthropologist who coined the term proxemics way back in 1963. We're not considered extremely high contact in the United States, but what about those regions and countries in the world that are? And you were mentioning India earlier as an example because of a population that is over 1.2 billion, where people tend to touch each other more and maintain closer interpersonal distance. How difficult will it be for people to practice social distancing in those countries?
it's going to be incredibly difficult. You know, you mentioned it. You know, this proxemics view of how different cultures, the personal space that they give, and what that means culturally for them, is going to be a big factor. You know, you mentioned we don't have that as much here in the United States, and you know, as living here for the past 20 years, you know, I guess that is somewhat true. But I think you also have to look at it. I mean, like, this is an incredibly diverse population here, from representing pretty much cultures from all over the world. So I think in pockets where you see regional populations going, I mean, I think in family groups, I think those cultural things still hold true. And while we have the advantage of being able to disseminate that information and understanding, I think that I think that's a big factor here. But like you say, in countries like India, culture, I mean, across Europe too, though. I mean, when you look at countries,
southern part of Europe, absolutely.
Yeah, and the Mediterranean countries, I mean, physical contact is a very big part of everyday life. You know, just in greetings and in the way the family structure works. Obviously, Italy is a big, you know, it's a big part there.
Sure.
India, just recently, I mean, you know, the way the country runs is very tightly bound to the religious makeup of the country, you know, and Hinduism, and there's so many activities in everyday life are sort of governed by those beliefs, and you know, congregation for prayers and celebrating religious holidays, you know, a very, very big holiday. And I think this is similar across the world. Many nations and many cultures have ways of celebrating the advent of spring. You know, and in India, it's a holiday called Holi, or a religious day called Holi, which is basically celebrating the arrival of spring. And you know, it's usually celebrated by mass crowds having a party, and where they get together and they throw colored dye on each other to signify the arrival of, you know, the blooming of the crops and flowers and all those kinds of things. And you know, I've been away from there for a while, but I'm probably not doing it justice. But you know, even back in the UK where my folks still live, all those activities were, I wouldn't say banned, but you know, they were told that you couldn't do that. You know, and so it has a dramatic effect.
Well, then I'm thinking of what. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking of what you said as far as when we look at Southern Europe, the Mediterranean on both sides, North Africa, and the Middle East as well. Just the practice of communal meals and sitting together and having people come over to one's house. I've heard that very rarely people of the aforementioned regions and countries ever eat alone. Yes. Because there's always somebody, either your immediate family or you know, a wider range of your clan or whatever, that will be with you and will share a meal with you. And then the way it's done, the idea of, you know, sitting together and having one large dish that everybody is scooping food out of, I think those are all things that are very difficult to change, and to tell people, well, you have to practice social distancing here. Yeah. I think is much more difficult because you have this cultural practice there, where in other societies it may be easier.
Yeah, and I can speak to that a little bit. You know, growing up in the UK, you know, I'm first generation, and you know, one of the things our parents tried to do for all the kids my generation is, even though we were growing up in a different culture, obviously to understand our heritage. So every, you know, my mom's door was never closed. There was always some family member coming over. Very rarely we ever had dinner where it was just me, my brother, and my dad, and my mom. You know, there was always uncles and aunts and cousins coming and going all times of the day, kind of thing. And so, yeah, it's incredibly hard. How do you change your entire way of life? And you know, in less developed worlds where it's such an integral part of everyday life,
Right.
It's going to be very, very difficult.
Now, going back to what we said earlier about the importance of having a global competence, the importance of looking at global data, the World Health Organization urges countries to unite to fight the pandemic together. What are some suggestions you have for international collaboration? What can we learn from each other?
Well, from a scientific point, obviously understanding, you know, as obviously we're trying to stem the spread. And so everything right now is focused on preventing that spread and the actions we can all take and the things that we're doing to make that more possible. As time moves on, obviously there are people working all over the world to develop vaccines, develop ways to test more efficiently, more people. I think it behooves all of us. I mean, I think this is something that happens in the scientific community anyway, where, you know, the dissemination of information can be rapid, you know, and done sometimes without borders. There are obviously economic pressures on things like that too, but I think beyond that, I mean, I think, you know, helping our neighbors, helping, you know, international aid is flowing in many directions. You know, obviously countries like Italy receiving help from their neighbors in Europe. I know while the border between the United States and Canada is currently closed, you know, these two nations continue to work closely together to try and tackle many of the issues that are arising from this. And I think as time goes on, the development of vaccines, the distribution of protective equipment that can help, you know, the frontline individuals who are dealing with this, the clinicians and the nurses.
Right.
You know, those kinds of things are going to be at this very early stage very, very important. And I think cooperation globally. I mean, these things, as we know, I mean, some of these things are, you know, only manufactured in certain countries. You know, obviously a lot of manufacturing in China. So when they shut down, it inadvertently affects the rest of the world. You know,
right.
And it's a supply and demand kind of world right now.
Right.
You know, and so I think being able to expand our ability to help nations who are suffering at this time, by whatever means, you know, it's going to be very, very important. And you know, I've heard, you know, the folks in charge of disseminating the information, and you can't envy what these people are having to do.
Yes.
To get their stuff out. You know, I mean, you look at a situation like New York, which sort of is like a microcosm of like what you might see in somewhere like India, or where I mean, it's truly an international city. There are so many people moving in and out of New York every day, and they've been hit hardest, and it sort of makes sense. But then how do we help? You know, how do we help those folks, you know, millions of people right there? I think, you know, I think it's going to take a concerted effort from all the nations of the world to try and help this. I mean, that seems a little idealistic, but I mean, I think that's the only way we're going to fight this. I mean, the other thing to keep in mind, it may be hard to see right now, But I've heard this sentiment too. As scientists, we're like, there'll be a beginning to this thing, there'll be a middle to this thing, and then there will be an end. And while it's hard to see that right now, I think as we work together, we can make that come around a lot sooner.
Right. Now, you said there will be an end to COVID-19, and the sooner the better, of course. But as a scientist, I wanted to ask you, what is the likelihood of COVID-19 becoming a cyclical, sort of seasonal disease that will revisit us? If COVID-19 is not the worst, if we look at it as a precursor for what might come our way in the future, a COVID-20 or a COVID-21, what have scientists learned so far? What can or should we learn for the next outbreak?
Oh, that's a very big question. I'm not an immunologist by trade. It's not my field of expertise, but I'm not sure in terms of whether it could be. There is this chance. In this unique case, it appears that there was a species jump and a transmission. Now that it's in the human population, by their very nature, the reason we have new vaccines for the flu every year is because it's in the population, it spreads around the world, but the vaccination helps. I don't know if COVID is going to behave in a similar manner now that it's already out. We already know scientifically that it's changing and mutating. There are, scientists around the world who are trying to work on this pandemic, as geneticists look at the genome of this thing. This is something we do with the human population now, in health and medicine. Scientists try and get a better handle on how this virus is mutating, what kind of rate of mutation. Are we, as they're trying to develop vaccines currently, how often, even in this particular case, not even looking to the future, will a vaccine that they develop provide immunity, consistently? Is the virus going to change rapidly? The other thing, host immunity, people who've already been infected. Do they now have a resistance to getting reinfected?
Right.
Other versions of we just don't know. There just hasn't. I don't think there's been enough time to get a handle on those kinds of questions currently, and people may be working on that. I'm not aware at this time, but that question, is something I think everybody sort of needs to be thinking about it, especially people in charge of tackling pandemics like this. The healthcare field and economically, can we take another hit like this, so soon after what's happening right now? Just projecting into the future, if it was to become, inevitably, I would hope that we would be better prepared for any future pandemics. You got to, like you said, you got to learn from what has happened, and I think one of the things is we're very, very resilient in that regard. There are incredibly smart people out there that are applying their expertise and knowledge to this to figure that out, and again speaks to the scientific collaboration across the planet to try and make sure that this doesn't happen again. So I can't give you an answer to that particular question. I'm the eternal optimist, and I think that what we learn from this will potentially prevent something like this becoming something like this as severe happening again. Though I can't speak to how common it becomes.
Sure.
Does it become seasonal like the flu?
Right. No, you're bringing up a good point. It's difficult to say. I've read a lot of information indicating that perhaps if there is a connection to the regular flu type virus, that we normally see a slowing of the curve when it gets warmer or hotter outside, because the flu doesn't like hot weather. The virus doesn't like hot weather, and it then subsides only to flare back up when it's colder again in the fall. And so the question is, but then you look at the map and you realize that there are COVID-19 infections in South America. And so in other places that are close to the equator. So there seems to be a different behavior of COVID-19 in regard to its temperature tolerance than perhaps the regular flu virus. But you're right; it's very early in this entire scenario to speculate. But I thought I'd throw this out there because
I think it's a really important question, and I'm sure, I mean, talking stateside, I'm sure the CDC is concentrating on that particular part of the question quite heavily too.
Right, and it seems to be that, you know, when we look at the last pandemic, the last flu pandemic, almost 100 years ago now, that there is. I mean, there has been a long period of time where nothing serious as far as a true pandemic has happened. We talked earlier, or I mentioned a little bit in my summary, the time of SARS and MERS, but those were not true pandemics. They were contained, and luckily, they never really spread around the world the way we now see with COVID-19. And so I'm just thinking, is there a likelihood that this will come back in a similar fashion, and what could we learn from this? One thing that I immediately thought of is certainly the reminder that we're perhaps all a little more interconnected than we might have thought, and you know, because of international travel, because of the way our supply chain works, and we're getting goods from all over the world. Once the ports are closed, you realize how many things are actually coming from somewhere else because they're not available anymore. And it, you know, in good times, so to say, one doesn't have a reason to think about this much because it's all available, and so you go and get it. And but in bad times, when you can't go and get it and purchase it, then you realize that it's all really interconnected, and something happening even as far away as Wuhan, China, may very well have a global impact, even if it's months down the road.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, there's as interconnected as the global economy is right now. You know, that's why, you know, we see such a dramatic effect, you know, obviously on the stock market and all of those things. Industry is hurting, you know, production is down everywhere because people, you know, to combat this disease, we have to take these really severe steps right now.
Right.
And so, but it does, I think, when you look at that, I think one of the interesting things, you know, obviously in this day and age, you know, as we're sitting here talking on two different sides of the city right now, you know, this the internet makes it so much easier for us to communicate and keep in touch. And I think one of the upsides of this, I think, has been exactly how much people are talking now. I think we've sort of gone through this, you know, not isolationism, but, you know, everyone becomes very much more insular, and mobile devices have made them, I'm going to sound like an old codger here now, but, you know, I think we're all very social beings, and some of that was being lost. And I think in light of this, I think one of the positives is that we've actually become reaching out to people and even our neighbors, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Times like this, while we might not be able to stand, more than 6 or 10 feet closer, it's like how much, we started to discuss with them and talk with them
right.
Through these other means. I think
right.
that's an important upswing to this part. It's not all. I want to say it's not all doom and gloom kind of thing.
No, and I think you're right. I mean, in all of this, there are certainly there's a silver lining, and that may be that communication as a whole, even though it's not happening face to face right now, but when I look at what is offered online, educationally, entertainment-wise, just this morning I heard that Elton John over the weekend has sort of initiated a concert, an online concert where
right.
various artists from around the world immediately signed on and basically played music out of their living room. And we've seen a lot of this happening in the last 2 weeks. The sort of the outlet, this creativity is still there, and the desire for people to interact with others. It's just that the medium has changed in which to deliver it. And that's, I think, an interesting thing to look at, because it hasn't really changed people. Mm-hmm. It has only changed the vehicle that we use. And hopefully that will stay the same.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point. It's also one of those, I'm a bit old school, and I look at it, it's like you don't know what you had until it's gone. I think you take it for granted.
Right.
That this interaction that you have. And, I watch my own kids. They've managed really well for a couple of weeks, but it starts telling. They want to meet, be with their friends and this, that, and the other. And this has provided a real outlet and, allowed them to maintain these really important bonds, I think, that are required to be a well-adjusted human being, I think. And I think that's just on a very local scale, but I think that's been highlighted globally.
Right. Now, that brings me to perhaps our last question, or my last question to you, and that is, you have, and I really appreciate your time and expertise and the fact that you were willing to share your view from a scientific perspective. But I also know that you are a husband and a father, and in these times, it's difficult to sort of deal with these things on various levels. It's one way to deal with it in the lab, perhaps. It's another to deal with it in a family setting. Any advice you have, or how you have dealt with this as a husband, as a father, that we could probably all relate to?
Well, I'm really lucky because I have an awesome wife. I got to say that first. But
shout out to the wife.
I think for me personally, with my family, we've been very, very lucky because both, my kids are a little older, so they have an understanding of what's going on and why what we're doing right now, while they may not be happy about it, they understand the importance of doing what we're doing. And, we're really lucky. I mean, we play games. We try and get outside as much as we can. Having the dog helps. Those kinds of fun things. I think also, for me, we've been, with what I'm doing, I continue to work, and so I look forward to actually getting home and seeing them still. I think we just we can laugh. We still get mad at each other. The social space thing still can be an issue, but I think if you keep it light, Keep it entertaining. There's so many ways we can interact. We've been speaking with family. Yesterday, we did the crossword with, family across the country. Or just little things like that to make things fun. There's ways around all of these issues at times, and my nieces and nephews, they've taken it upon themselves to like call my kids just out of the blue. Usually we do like a weekly call with all the family around the world. Family in Africa, family in India, family, I don't talk to them as often, but my family in the UK, these devices make that kind of thing so much easier. I think you have to keep your spirits high. It'd be very easy to get low with that isolation, and I think you just have to be thankful for, the fact that I'm very lucky that I have this incredible family to keep my spirits up. And I think you just you fall on your loved ones at that time.
Right.
I think that's important.
Well, Dr. Patel, I thank you for your time today, for being with us on International Voices, the March edition, and for doing the work that you're doing in all areas as a scientist. It's much appreciated, and I certainly enjoyed my time talking with you. I can't believe how quickly the time went by. And when you're sitting there, you always sort of think, a half an hour podcast, what if we run out of material? And then it has never happened when I think back, that because there's always enough to talk about. And as in this case, what I appreciated was you really digging in and giving us an insight into these questions that I had with your answers, and that's very much appreciated from my end.
Well, thank you, Udo, and thank you for the invite to come and chat with you. This was a lot of fun.
Of course. All the best to you.
You too. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.